Malawi, where the electricity comes and goes.
Whoa.
I think it went right.
Suiting action to word.
Yeah. So yeah, so he was saying that he's in Malawi and sometimes like electricity comes and goes. So probably like he's got like some technical problems with that. But let's see and let's wait a little bit if he connects again once again.
Malawi, where the electricity comes and goes.
Let me see.
That was amazing timing. I was just saying that the electricity has been wonky today and has been coming and going even more than usual, but hopefully we won't have that problem again. So let's share the screen one more time.
Yeah. Do you want me to share the screen? Okay, that's fine. Otherwise I can.
I honestly didn't do that on purpose, but the timing couldn't have been more appropriate.
Okay.
And it's fun. I wrote this chapter back like 2017. So it's been fun to take a look at it again. So some of this I look at all the time, and some of it's been a couple of years. So it'll be fun to go through it together. But the idea, as you know, was that I was working on these things anyways over the past, since the early 1990s, I guess. And it was nice to have a chance to try to put it all together and encapsulate it in one chapter of the ideas of how development and livelihoods fit together, and all of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation fitting together within development and how it all fits together. So the way I generally have to start this is I know that you get lots of different terminology from lots of different people, and I don't want to disrupt the flow of how it's going with the people that are, that you work with in terms of how you see things. But this is how I see things. And the reason why there's a picture of a boy with a pair of scissors is because I see things that anything that can be a resource is also a hazard. And anything that can be a hazard is also a resource. So the example of the boy with the scissors is that pair of scissors can be very useful as a resource to cut things, but that same pair of scissors can also very much cause injury to that boy. Of course, when we think of disaster problems, we think of water as one example of not enough water is a problem. Too much water is a problem. Both of those are hazards. And just the right amount of water is a perfect resource. So I like to think of it in terms of how do we make things and change our hazards into resources, and how do we make it so that we can best use that? And one of those is making sure that people have access. And so every time I'm saying access, it's about the resources and about how the processes to combine those resources result in functions, mainly for livelihoods and service provision. The biggest problem that we have is when people don't have access to begin with. So we can't even start talking about the loss of access and disruption of access because of disasters until we talk about people having access to begin with. So we don't start with the problem of the disaster. We start with making sure we understand access and understanding development and understanding how some marginalized people don't even have access to begin with, or they're in a situation in which they can lose access to the things they need very easily. So development is a process of improving this access, but understanding who is it for, and are the things that we're doing for development improving access for the marginalized people, or are some of the things that we're doing creating disaster and processes of disaster risk creation, maldevelopment, making things worse for some people while they make some things better for others? We have to remember that we're not just talking about disaster risk, because people every day have problems of access. There's everyday chronic risk where people can, the road gets blocked and they can't get the health care that they need. They can't get the resources that they need. And that can be exacerbated in seasonal times, heavy rains, other things that make it so that there's regular access to disruption, in addition to disaster risk that we need to consider. So that would be the extreme access disruption from a major shock. So our disaster risk management is going to try to minimize the potential for extreme access disruption, but we need to be considering that, integrating that together. Maximizing access, that will be the development part, but also minimizing both regular and extreme access disruption. Those of you some of you may have been warned that I am not somebody who tends to talk. I tend to sing what I do because I feel like we can all remember it better. But let's start with this is the chorus of a song that I wrote, because the focus, as I said, is not the disaster. The focus has to be access. Everything that we're looking at has to be ensuring that people get access and keep access. So the first line of the chorus is access for everyone that's undeniable. And then part 2 of that would be access that's everyday, sustained, and reliable. So we have to make sure that everybody gets it, and we have to make sure that everybody keep it. And the way that we do that is through risk-managed development. We're going to optimize risks. That confuses a lot of people, but when we're talking about disaster risk reduction, we don't call it disaster risk elimination. Because of the idea that we have to be integrating this, we have to be understanding that there are other risks that people face.
Probably we have like some problems again, like with electricity. So let's try to, I will share the slide where he was.
I'm now in the dark, but hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we can hear you.
No longer on electricity. I'm now on my data, but hopefully you can see my shining face in here.
Yeah. Do you want me to share the screen?
Yeah, let's do that again. It must be this one, yeah. So the idea, we're not going to eliminate risks. We're going to optimize, we're going to reduce risks, because there are certain things, we can't say, the 10,000 year flood. We're not going to build a wall. We're not going to build a dome around the whole town. There are certain things, and risk can be a good thing. There are opportunities that come along with risks. And we need to be optimizing this also across what are the opportunities every day. People want to live in the floodplains because those are where the good land is. People want to live near volcanic soil, which means living near the volcano. There are many reasons why people want to take those risks because of the opportunities that come with them. So we need to figure out a way to optimize that. So we're going to be looking at that in terms of the livelihood and the service needs and how people can do it in a way that they can adapt. So the whole idea is access, short and long term. And we're going to emphasize that many times. And this is the point at which we sing together. This song's about the significance of access to what people need, and it goes like this. I hope I hear you singing along. Access, short and long-term access, short and long-term access, short and long-term. The first part is to overcome barriers not letting some people get needed levels of basic societal functions and systematize these BSFs and processes and resources that'll allow them to assess what should be done to resist and respond to everyday risk from stress. So reliably, there'll be less disruption of access. For everyone, it's undeniable access. Everyday, sustained, reliable access. Through risk managed development, optimizing risk to get livelihood and service needs met, evolving in adaptive ways, and thereby remaining viable for access. Here we go. Short and long-term access. Short and long-term access. Short and long-term. The next part is to agree how to plan for what could be, causing changes to these functions in the rare extremes, with process contingencies, early surge capacities, and livelihood and basic social service strategies to resist and respond to the shock so we can minimize the disruption vulnerability of access. For everyone, it's undeniable access. Everyday, sustained, reliable access. Through risk managed development, optimizing risk to get livelihood and service needs met, evolving in adaptive ways, and thereby remaining viable for access. Short and long-term access. Short and long-term access. Short and long-term. Having it and keeping it's what risk managed development's about. By deciding and prioritizing what should be the best action route for mitigating and preparing to minimize people going without. If you think this is important, why don't you join with me and shout about access. For everyone, it's undeniable access. Everyday, sustained, reliable access. Through risk managed development, optimizing risk to get livelihood and service needs met, evolving in adaptive ways, and thereby remaining viable. Ow! For access. Short and long-term access. Short and long-term access. Short and long-term access. I don't think anybody's going to forget the word access after that. So hopefully we get it, and we're going to move forward from that, and we're going to see how are we going to get all of those things that are mentioned in that song. Well, not to make things go crazy and not to make you feel really confused after singing, but myself and Jessica Mercer have a paper, Asian Journal, Disaster Management, Environment and Disaster Management, in which we discuss the different types of integration. And because it's always been so confusing to me, and every time I hear people saying integrated this, integrated that, and it always seems like they're talking about something different. So I decided to make a paper and a little diagram that explains all the different types of integration and what needs to be incorporated if we're If we start from the bottom, from number 8, if you see on the right, talking about multidisciplinary, integrating across disciplines, looking at the biophysical and the socioeconomic, making sure that we have understanding exposure and vulnerability and capacity on the biophysical side, and how does that lead into the social, the economic vulnerability, the social vulnerability that ends up leading to the types of problems that need to be addressed. So we link those up in terms of disciplines. If we go to number 7, that's the temporal. We don't want to be looking just right now at what the risks are. We have to be understanding what they were in the past, what they are now, and what they're going to be in the future. We want to integrate across the risk factors, number 6. Understanding that they're across time, that's why the arrow is pointed there, that we have different things happening and that hazards are changing, but we also have different everyday stressors. We have trends of things that are changing how the hazards and the stressors are affecting people's access to the things that they need. Of course, for number 5, we have our different methods. We're going to integrate across qualitative and quantitative methods. For number 4, this is our sectoral integration. We have our basic societal functions that were mentioned in the song: environmental services, food and income with livelihoods, healthcare, education, shelter and power, water and sanitation, physical safety, transport, communication, entertainment, culture and religion. Every society has these. The question is, how are they organized? How do you take the resources that you have and organize them in some way through different processes into functions so that people have access to these different functions and the things that they need for them? So we're going to integrate across those in terms of decision making. And the way we're going to do that is moving up to the next level at number 3, stakeholder integration. Divided here in terms of which ones are external: the NGOs, the government agencies, the international agencies, the scientific researchers, and those who are internal, the vulnerable groups themselves, the producers and the institutions that are working internally in the community, in the local area, the local government groups. And how are we going to link them together to be able to make decisions? This process is through the analysis of risks, understanding and iterating until we get a hybrid risk knowledge across the shareholders, across the stakeholders, across the stakeholders, we do this hybrid risk knowledge creation. And from that, we get to the assessment process of saying, what should we prioritize for risk reduction? What risks are unacceptable that we're going to allow, and we're going to end up having residual risk reduction to address those, the acceptable levels. For those that are unacceptable, we then have to say, what are we going to do to mitigate? What are we going to do to prepare to make sure that we're taking away or reducing those risks to make them down to acceptable levels? But we then need to take it up to level number 2, because this has to be integrated into development. Disaster risk is not the only thing, as we mentioned. We have other priorities in development. So we have to be mainstreaming disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation within overall development planning, and understanding that our risk reduction priorities are one component of that, but a very important component to make sure that we're developing in a way where people get access and they don't lose it. And the final one at the top is we have to remember that if we're looking at this from the perspective of one community, that what's endogenous to that community is affected by what's happening outside that community, both horizontally and vertically. So we're going to be looking spatially at what happens to other places and what decisions are being made in other places, especially like, for example, in a watershed. How do we link to the other communities along that watershed? And what are the decisions that are being made higher up along the river, along the watershed, coming down, that are going to affect people lower? And so then we also, in addition to the spatial, we have the governance of how that is working in terms of we have our local governance, but then we have higher levels of governance to manage all that. And what's the decision made? What is the voices? How do we have voice that affects the decisions that get made to affect that? That's the background to how the paper starts, the chapter starts, which was starting with a sustainable livelihoods model. This sustainable livelihoods model that I used as the basis to start is kind of a hybrid over the years, since the origins from DFID back in the 90s. But the basic idea is, if you start in the middle where the assets are, you see the N, the P, the F, the S, and the H. Those are our resources, as I mentioned. The N is the natural resources, the P is the physical infrastructural, the F is the financial, the S is the social, and the H is the human. There's many other ways of organizing that, but everything kind of fits nicely in our little pentagram there. So those are our different types of resources to be managed. The way that those get managed is through the next step onto the right. We transform them. We take those resources and we change them somehow. That's through what's called in this the PIPs, which is the policies, the institutions, and the practices. Or in the box, the structures and the processes. This is going to be how we change our resources into something. And what we're doing there is we're changing them through strategies. In the original sustainable livelihoods model, it was entirely about livelihoods. What livelihood strategies do we have to transform these resources into something that is going to lead to the outcomes that we want? We want to have improved income, we want to have better food security, and this is all going to feed back into our resources, into how all these things go in this loop. It's going to affect our natural resources that we have for the next time and for the next loop. So we want to be able to do this in a way that sustains the resources. Now, if we go all the way to the left, we see this also affects the vulnerability context. This is now where we have to consider, what are the risks? What is it that makes us vulnerable? What is it that makes us exposed to having problems with these resources or to be able to get these outcomes that we want? So as mentioned, we have chronic problems, everyday things that cause disruptions. We have seasonal problems, and then we have extreme disaster problems. So these lead to exposure and vulnerability that then contribute to inability to use the resources, losing them or damaging them in ways that make them not optimal to use, or can improve them. There's the basis, and that was the original sustainable livelihoods model. When I was looking at this, of how to make it into something that we could look at to address making all of this fit together for risk managed development, I said there's a couple of problems with this model. One of them is there's no spatial integration. It doesn't consider the exogenous. Everything here is endogenous to the community. It is not considering exogenous factors that are external, contributing to the vulnerability context effects. It's not considering development happening in other places and both the benefits and the detriments that that causes to our resources and our ability to do things. It's not considering environmental effects, including climate change, creeping environmental problems, and other things that are contributing to whether our abilities to do things with our resources are increasing or getting worse. Secondly, there isn't much in here that's temporal. There is a small feedback loop from the outcomes, but it really isn't looking at the effects of what's happening externally and internally to our resources and to our processes and outcomes, and what can be done over time. A third thing is, as mentioned before, the governance. We're looking at the integration to the other places by going to higher levels. And so there isn't anything about how are we changing the PIPs, those policies, institutions, and practices. How are we changing our social capital, our human capital, to make it so that we have better voice, to make it so that we can better influence decision-making that covers outside of our place as well as inside our place. And the final thing is, this is only covering livelihoods. And while livelihoods is very important for contributing to the income and the other ways of getting the things that we need, we also need to have ways of getting basic social services, and we also have to have management of disaster risks and other risks to make it so that we can do this. So that's the basis of my suggested changes to this model. Addressing the first one, spatial integration. All I've done to the model is added, instead of having just the endogenous internal development considered, I've now added this blue component, the exogenous external trends, including the fact that there's uncertainty in the future. So now we have incorporated the effects on the stresses and shocks of what's happening with the environment, what's happening with climate change and creeping environmental problems, and also what's happening with development in other places. As I mentioned before, like the example of the watershed and other things that are happening, so many different things happening through development that is contributing to the chronic and seasonal and extreme potential problems that we have. So there's the spatial. Second, I mentioned the governance. And I mentioned before, let's start there on the vertical one with the social and the human capital in the resources. Because one of the ways that we're going to address governance is by improving people's abilities. So this could be the individual capacities of people to be able to contribute, but also the social capital and the entire thing of how people make decisions and how they're able to have a better voice, to be able to work together, to be able to influence, if we go up to the governance of PIPs, to be able to say, all right, these are things that are affecting us that are happening outside. So we're better be able to make decisions our own, but we can also better influence the people outside and tell the higher levels of government that there are problems and we need to work on these things together. Next, when I was talking about sectoral, we remember we have the livelihoods component. We also had the various different types of basic societal functions that fall under basic social services, healthcare, nutrition, education, training, shelter, power, etc. And then we also have merging with these two together to make sure that we have risk reduction, transfer, and response to ensure that we minimize disruption of these. To be clear, I understand many of you are the first year in studying disaster risk management, so I didn't want to use terms that were a little bit confusing. But if we're looking at the different types of disaster risk reduction, if we go to the bottom, as I mentioned in the original integration diagram, when we look at and we do our assessment and we're seeing what's unacceptable, we then can look at what's already happened. And so that's what we call corrective risk reduction, is we say, we've looked at what's already happened because of previous disaster risks. When a landslide happened, we say, okay, the landslide happened. We can then do conservative corrective risk reduction based on our experiences and rebuild those assets. Or we can look at it progressively and say progressive corrective risk reduction. In this case, we're looking at the root causes. Why did the landslide happen? What is it that caused the people who are living next to the river to be inundated with the floods? It isn't entirely because of the water. There are other reasons. There are things that people are doing. So it's not just a matter of rebuilding the assets. It's going to be a matter of understanding what the root causes are and addressing them. Both of those fall under corrective based on what happened in the past. The next step would be to say, but things are changing. Things are changing very rapidly, even more rapidly than ever before. Climate change is one factor that is making things in many places change rapidly, but development is changing things very rapidly too, and making things at an unprecedented thing that you can look at it and say, the types of disaster risk that were before may very well not be the same places that had landslides before. There may be very different places that have those, and all kinds of other effects that may be very different. So this is what's called prospective risk reduction, where we anticipate. So it's anticipatory and looking at the future and understanding both what can happen to the assets and what the root causes can be to be more adaptive. What comes out of that, as I've said before, is of course we can't mitigate and be adaptive for everything. There are some things that within our risk optimization, we have to leave be that are going to happen. We're going to do risk reduction up to a certain level. And then for some of it, we need to just accept that there are certain risks and be prepared. And for that, we have residual risk reduction. There will be some damages and loss. And for those, we have to be prepared to respond and do things to minimize the losses and the disruptions then. And hopefully, opportunity through disaster, even though it's a terrible thing for us to think about in the immediate aftermath when people are suffering, but usually there's a change in the paradigm. Something is different that we can think of like, this whole build back better idea. How can we take advantage of what happened and say we can do something different that's going to be better after the event happened and change things to make it as an opportunity? So looking at that in terms of our diagram, we originally had under the strategies only livelihoods. Now the idea is, let's make it adaptive. Let's make it across the different sectors. So now all of those sectors I had listed before under livelihoods and basic social services, we're going to be looking at how to transform our resources through our PIPs and ways so that we can best deliver livelihoods and basic social services and make sure that at the same time, we minimize the disruption of those by making sure that we have the mix of prospective risk reduction, corrective risk reduction, and residual risk reduction, and the consideration of opportunities when they arise. All of this leading to the outcomes, which leads to the final addition to it, is now the temporal integration. If you see the remaining things in blue and a couple arrows in red, let's start with the risk scenario. Coming out of our vulnerability context, we have an arrow coming. And what we're saying is, we want to anticipate, we want to be thinking about how this vulnerability context, what is happening in terms of the environmental change, in terms of developmental change, all of the different things that are contributing to how the stresses and shocks are changing. How is that going to affect what we need to do? And so we need to incorporate those risk scenarios into our strategies for what we can do. If we go further to the right, we now need to be optimizing and say, it's not just about making development so that today we're better off. We need to be thinking about tomorrow, the next year after that, and optimizing and integrating that to say, yes, we want this year's yields to be better. We want this year's yields to be great, but not at the expense of next year's yields and down the road. We don't want to be doing things in a way that's going to lead to our children suffering. So we need to be balancing current well-being outcomes with the future well-being outcomes. So our increased income, food security, natural resource use, service access, and decreasing disruptions, balancing across now and the future. And so what we end up with is that model, which looks very confusing, but hopefully now you've seen how we've gone from the original sustainable livelihoods model to this integrated risk managed development approach to using sustainable livelihoods now as an overall conceptual framework for looking at what can we do to make it so that each of these components, all of these elements of integration are incorporated to make it so that we can be managing our risks as part of development. So that was the theory of the chapter. And then I had a whole bunch of examples, which of course there won't be time to do that, all of them now. But I figured we would take the first example from your neighbor in Peru. And this was PACC, Programa de Adaptation a Cambio Climático. And there were a bunch of different components of this. And the basic vulnerability context is a lot of highland rural communities, low human development and poverty, ecosystems and fragile mountains, a lot of impacts of climate change and potential impacts of climate change as well, making it so that there are all kinds of potential problems, especially with access to water. Other external problems, major problems with soil erosion, not understanding how the markets are changing, and conflicts over the use of water, and internally not taking care of the resources. A lot of the water sources were being degraded very badly, overgrazing, fires, many different internal problems that needed to be addressed. So how do we look at this together? What they did was they broke it down by resource type. And it was about a lot of restoration of the natural resources, making sure the conservation, the restoration of the natural resources, making physical infrastructural things that complemented that weren't built specifically as infrastructure, as a stand-all be-all, but the idea that physical infrastructure was integrated with this to make it so that it was going to contribute to the way that the natural resources were working as well. And introducing microfinance so that people had the opportunity to make decisions about what could be done in ways that could help sustain their livelihoods, in ways that would also help sustain the different needs for sustaining the environment as well. And then, as we mentioned, the importance of the human resources and the social resources, a lot of training in the types of things that would be needed to make sure that these types of agriculture and these types of natural resource management and other value-added production could be possible. And then also the social capital, needing to train people to be in the committees, community associations, training people in how to run the microfinance, and all of the different training and adaptation and preparedness, women's groups and everything, this all led to the PIPs being improved, people's ability to make decisions improved. And then this, of course, leads to the improved governance and includes to better improved decision-making over time. Another example, Ethiopia, combination of the health extension program. So I know a lot of people, when they're thinking about disaster risk management, aren't necessarily thinking about health extension workers as being frontline people. But man, health extension workers are awesome because they can actually see, they're on the ground. And if we can actually work with them to think about how things are changing, they're the front line of understanding adaptation because they can actually see when things are changing and say, hey, something's changing. I think I also gave in the chapter the examples of the Guarianas from Colombia, Manizales, and there's many others examples of this. It doesn't have to be health extension workers, but making it so that there's people at the local level, underemployed people, who can now be responsible for identifying what's happening. Combining this in Ethiopia with the Productive Safety Net program, which the idea of that was there had been years and years, 40 years of giving people relief. And it clearly wasn't working. So then was the idea of like, let's, instead of giving pure relief, let's give people assets, productive assets that they can use to help take them out of the chronic poverty that gets exacerbated by the droughts and make it so that they can sustain themselves. And then the idea came, how about if we combine sustainable land management with these productive assets, with the health extension workers into one program that could be built on adaptation? So this is the idea, is that there were many problems with chronic problems and acute when the drought happened. So there needed to be preventive and curative procedures to make this better. Like I said before, there need to be some people who could identify the problems quickly and also make sure that people have access, even if they're migrating. So how do we then integrate that and trying to get it so that people can find ways that they can stay where the facilities are? Because, you know, health facilities and schools don't move normally. Most service facilities stay where they are. And in fact, most water sources and everything that we try to build, all the physical infrastructure tends to stay in one place. So when people are migrating, it's very difficult. So we need to somehow combine that and say, how do we make it so that more people stay, but also knowing that some people are going to have to move? Find ways to make it so that there's access when they move. The way to do that was an evolutionary process. And often people think that something has to happen, like we do one strategy and it's going to take care of it. The silver bullet. Well, this was not a silver bullet. It's still ongoing and still evolving. But the idea was, let's start the health extension program and make it so that people can, the extension workers can just have a basic rudimentary understanding of what treatment is. Now you see at the very top, there's a solid pink line. What that means is when that happened, it was still entirely aid, giving away relief to deal with the chronic and acute problems. As this happened, at the start of the extension program, they started the Productive Safety Net program. That's the purple. And it was to say, let's give people assets to try to build capacity so that they can sustain themselves and not have to get this relief anymore. And at the same time, starting the community management of acute nutrition, teaching people to manage it themselves, working through the evolving extension program, that then it would make it so that people could work on acute malnutrition themselves without constantly needing relief. Step 2, expanding the extension program, making the capacity so it's not just treatment, but there's some prevention, involving mothers groups, involving many other people. So it, as the extension worker now takes on more responsibility, some of those responsibilities get delegated to other people in the communities. And there become more and more committees for dealing with these things. So as more of these things happen, now we have more of the assets going towards the service strategies, going towards better agricultural production, better nutrition, and making it so that we have less. You see, the relief has gone down. The community management of acute malnutrition has increased. And now we've started with community-based nutrition. As we go further, we reach a certain level for that context of what the optimal level of extension will be. Make it so that community-based nutrition can happen with full diagnosis of what problems are, so that people themselves can be making decisions about what needs to be done. And we integrate this into an overall resilience strategy of making it so that, of course, there's still going to be some relief, but we're minimizing the amount of relief so that we have much more of the community management of the problem based on what we've done to, as we said in the initial thing, improve the governance by improving the social and the natural and the human resources. So as we said in our original model, we've done a lot of things dealing with how we're approaching the different elements of integration to make that possible. There were lots of other examples given in the chapter. I'll just a couple of them, because we mentioned when talking about the temporal integration, the key of planning, risk scenarios. And there are many examples given in the chapter about how to do risk scenarios and different ways of doing it. Some of the examples that have happened in Kenya and also here in Malawi are the participatory scenario planning. And the idea is that you've got that hybrid knowledge creation of taking it so that you have external people coming with their ideas, their perceptions of what it is, what the scenario should be, but you also have the internal stakeholders coming with what their perceptions are of how things are changing and what's important, and then bridging those things together to co-create the scenario and make decisions based on that. We also have many examples of the microfinance, especially through VSLAs, Village Savings and Loan Associations. I think these are awesome. I think because most people think it's just about the microfinance, but what it really ends up doing is empowering people to have better skills and a better decision-making ability, and it gives them more voice. So it makes it that in these examples where people had many, many different problems, but just by giving a tiny little bit of money that they could have control over, they had to make decisions about how that money could be used. But that byproduct was that they ended up having a forum where they could come together and talk about how things were changing and what needed to be done to address it. In summary, rather than conclusions, I put it as calls to action, types of things that need to be done by the institutions and by us. Needing to focus on being more adaptive locally, looking at not silver bullet solutions, but investing long-term. It's a big problem with the UN agencies, with the donors, is that we don't have long-term funding. And we've been arguing about this forever. But hopefully these examples and understanding how things are changing, that we need evolutionary processes. There have to be funding, and we need to be able to invest in long-term evolution of increasing local capacity, so that local capacity can be the ones that say, that's what's changing. And we need to have the decision-making and action at the local level to be able to do that. Another thing is being adaptive flexibly. We need to be able to think about and anticipate what the local conditions are going to be. Thinking about how to make this evolution fit with what that's going to be. Making sure that we have capacities for surge when certain things happen. Making sure that we have the financing available, as I just said. Even physical structures. Some physical structures, it's possible to make them adaptive and to be thinking about technologies and what we can do to make that so that we're not static and that they can adapt. Strategically, looking at the strategies, as we mentioned, about livelihood and service strategies don't need to be separate, and DRR is not separate from either. How do we integrate those and incorporate them in looking at how things are changing and make it so that we have adaptive strategies for each of these that are going to optimize how we make sure that that access is there. And then, of course, the same thing as was mentioned, the accountability, making sure that people have to be accountable to these adaptive solutions and looking at the risk scenarios and understanding it's not about what happened in the past, but we have to be accountable to making decisions about how this is going to be integrated and each element of integration and looking at what can be done. That's the conclusion of what was in the chapter. Of course, there were lots and lots of different examples, which we can talk about if anybody has any questions. When I spoke with Miguel, he said that I could include a few other songs, but I will leave that up to you because I don't want to push my music on you. But I, of course, have many others, but I would much rather leave the rest of the time for talking about questions and anything that you have about this approach or anything else that you would like to talk about. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really great to see the presentation, explain it as it was. I read the chapter and it was very interesting. But what you explained right now, I think like brings a lot more information and make sure that the information is very clear presented. So I think for sure we want to hear more songs, but probably we can like go to the questions and answers, and then like we can wrap up with the songs that you may want to present as well. What do you think about that?
Good plan.
Okay. So is there any question from the participants here in the meeting?
Can we stop sharing the screen and
Yeah, sure.
so we can see one another?
Sure.
Good idea. Aha.
I have one question. Thank you, Bob, for your talk. Do you have examples of governments that are using, for example, an integrated disaster risk management perspective?
I thought there was more. That was the whole question. All right. I think we should look at that on a spectrum rather than a dichotomy. And I think if we were to look at that 20 years ago, you know, at the end of IDNDR, before Sendai, before governments were pushed and required to sign on for the types of integration that are required by Sendai and now Hyogo, or Hyogo then Sendai, sorry. I think there's more of it than there was before. I think to look at, I think it would be an interesting study to, rather than just look at, you know, the ticking of the boxes for the Sendai framework, to actually take it and take this framework and say which, you know, governments are actually doing more in terms of this types of integration, which are doing more in the terms of this type of integration. And I have not done that exercise. So I don't have specific examples of, you know, which ones, but I do believe that along the spectrum there, you can even look at those reports of how people are meeting, how they met Hyogo, how they're meeting Sendai, and you can see some of those are parts of the requirements. So that would give an indication of which ones are doing better or worse along those lines.
Well, I think could I follow that question? I mean, I really appreciated the presentation and the chapter. It's too bad that Elon isn't on this. I don't know why he's not here, but he edited that book, and you made a wonderful contribution to the book. I also love the song. I was tapping my foot and sort of, but look, about governance, you seem to be more optimistic than I am. And that's okay, because that's a continuum too. And I'm optimistic. I tend to follow Gramsci, who spoke about pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. One one can look at various examples, particularly at subnational level, and see that there are various cities,
Right.
for instance, do have progressive and accountable governments and are really trying to do something. But on the whole, I think what you've left out, Bob, and I'd like you to comment on, is corruption. Corruption. Right. I mean, this, for people who know me and know my work, you probably expected that I'd rant about corruption, but it is a reality. And for instance, among the big stakeholders, and I don't know where they would fit into your various schemas, are landlords. I mean, landlordism is formal and right. Informal, hidden and overt, is still a major factor in various big cities in Mexico. You have people who, in the shadows, who support poor people, encourage poor people to quote, spontaneously settle in various areas of the periphery. They're known as the paracaístas, okay, the parachutists. Now, in fact, this is to secure the land eventually for that shadowy, informal landlord in the background to acquire and build and invest. And I mean, there are just so many examples right. of these, of landlordism, either in its feudal or its contemporary capitalist form. So perhaps you could comment really on the political, ecological, but above all, the political side of this. What does, so once your PIP, does the empowerment of the local people through, say, the microfinance, and I've looked at microfinance myself, for instance, in Tanzania, and in fact, it probably encourages more internal dissension in communities than it does actually pull people together. And the village I lived in for 2 years in northeastern Tanzania, the very popular manager ran away with the entire annual budget of the village. Yeah. But nevertheless, there are realities of power and misuse of power that I'm wondering whether these, it falls within the scope of the more empowered actors at the local level to influence these local voices. How are they going to deal with these landlords? How are they going to deal with the corrupt politicians that invite in the big project? I mean, I think the China's Belt and Road investments in Africa are going to disrupt huge numbers of people and massive expanses of land, and have a lot of ecological knock-on effects. And some of these will be mitigated, others will be ignored, and a lot has to do with who is minding the store. I mean, with a big investment like that from China, who has the courage, who has the motivation in the government to actually act as a watchdog? So I'll stop there. Thank you. But thank you above all for the wonderful presentation.
Thanks for that. And I love the question. You know more than anybody in this group that you and I have had conversations over the years. So I'm with you on the pessimism, or at least the realism. We've discussed about many of the problems and why things can't happen. In terms of my answer to Victor, I made the very quick answer, which because I was thinking, if we were to do a discussion of political ecology, of what happens, that would be a whole nother presentation maybe a whole nother course or maybe a whole nother program. But I'm with you on that, and that does need to be, and I guess when I was presenting it, the idea is these are things that can, but not necessarily do. And there are examples. The examples in Karamoja that I gave, the other ones, it was working, at least at the time. And so the longer answer to Victor's question is that I don't think there's a single country I worked in that isn't still response focused. It's still residual risk reduction. They're moving more towards disaster risk reduction, but we have to come back to what Ben said on that as well, is that it's politically in their favor to do response, because response gets them esteem. They get votes out of showing up and saying that we did this, whereas disaster risk reduction generally isn't as sexy. And so there's a whole political problem of trying to shift disaster risk management. Of course, we can talk about that forever. But so the whole idea of moving towards this integration and local empowerment and everything inherently has problems. And local people as well like getting free stuff. And we can talk about the disincentive problems and everything like that, but it's a thing where shifting that becomes harder. The corruption problem, I've seen the same things that you mentioned, Ben, everywhere. All my years in the Philippines, here in Malawi, it's a thing where even if they are using the ideas of disaster risk management, they're using it as an excuse to steal the land from people. And they're using it as a way to power grab, as you said, and take away ancestral land by saying you need to relocate rather than looking at ways to make it work. But there are steps in the right direction towards that. And so despite that happening over the years, there's been some give and take. And I do believe that part of that has been because some people have had a stronger voice to do it. So one way or another, that S has to be stronger so that people aren't completely lacking the knowledge of what's happening to them and just being sheep and being moved, but somehow making it that they can say, how does this work? And so in some cases, I believe that the VSLAs, it's not going to work. The PIPs aren't going to work if the people aren't the right people to make it work. If the people at higher levels of governance are not going to let it work, well, then nothing that we do is going to work to change that. But a way in certain contexts, and we could look at a political ecology breakdown of that, of what would need to be the requisite conditions to make that work, I think would be an interesting analysis to say, of course, it's not going to work all the time, but what can be done to make it such that VSLAs can be effective, and they can be effective for more than the microfinance. How can we deal with the landlords? It depends on the nature of the landlords and what they're doing. It depends on how do we evolve the laws and everything. So I guess tempered optimism with realism about what can really work based on what you said very eloquently and well about there's many, many problems with saying that these things do work. But I would prefer to say that these things can work, or many other examples, as long as we get to the theory and we base it on the theory and then try to make it, finding out contextually what can work there or what cannot work.
There is another question from Camilo Fernandez, who is watching on YouTube. So he's asking if you have considered risk transfer insurance schemes for supporting livelihoods of vulnerable local communities as a complement of disaster risk management activities?
Yes, I didn't include examples of those, but it's very important. Similar to what we were just talking about, there's a lot of examples of why risk transfer doesn't work, but there are interesting institutions being developed, and there's interesting possibilities. Hopefully we're learning from the mistakes. And there are a few different examples in different parts of the world in which stakeholder involvement, the integration across stakeholders and understanding what really is needed in terms of the risk transfer, that people will actually utilize it in a way that helps to reduce the risks. Hopefully that makes sense in terms of why there have been problems with that over the years and why we don't have the appropriate uptake of risk transfer at the local level. But I am optimistic, tempered optimism, that we're going to find some solutions, and we're in the process of finding some solutions that are going to work better.
So I do have a question actually. Like I also work with local communities right now here in Brazil, and sometimes like you find like this political will that kind of like, you know, doesn't allow you to continue even when like the community is very available to work. So how do you see like, or what could be your advice to kind of face with these kind of issues that probably more than myself are facing in the field?
If I understand the question correctly, it was that the political will is not there. And so there's a spectrum of that, and a different spectrum, I guess, of the types of things that are required for that political will. There's a difference in terms of at what level we're working. If it's just working with one community, like the communities I work with here in Malawi, it's basically a graduation program of that, you know, if you don't do this to lead to the next step, and if you don't have the political will to make it happen, there's 1,000 other communities that want us to work there. So it's, you know, that's up to you. But that's a different thing when we're one community versus another. If we're looking at a higher level thing and the political will is of not making it happen, there's, you know, when you're in negotiation and the rules of negotiation, the whole getting to yes book, and we're looking at positions versus interests. And I guess that would be the only possible thing, would be to try to figure out what is possible, given the interests. The political will have interests of, you know, what they're doing. And so getting it so that there's, you know, some dialogue that happens to understand what their interests are, and if there's anything that can be started. And if we can somehow have success, you know, with a certain things, and maybe that can get the ball rolling towards more political will being possible for other things. As one possible, I'm sure many other people would have lots of other suggestions, but in the interest of time, that would be one possibility.
Thank you, Bob. Andrea?
Hi, Bob. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. I happen to be here because I'm accompanying my wife, who's part of the group. So I seized the occasion and I listen to you. We've been all co-authors in the book. I got chapter 8, just making some publicity, but nothing directly on your presentation, which I really liked and resounded a lot also with my work during my PhD, etc. But something I asked to Ben already in a previous presentation, I really want to size this occasion. The book At Risk was published more than 30 years ago. Yeah? So in a way, we are all, you know, the son and the daughters of those who path-breakingly, you know, open up a new era. Why have we managed so little in really becoming mainstream in this area? Because we are not. We are still doing emergency assistance in many places. Of course, in this kind of environment, like the course in Victor's mind, we are mainstream, but we are not mainstream in the world. That's my, and of course, I understand that globalization has hammered very hard on this, of course, but I was nonetheless interested in listening to you on these questions specifically. Thanks.
There goes the long, deep sigh. It's definitely not an easy question to answer, and it's frustrating. It's really frustrating that there's, I mean, Ben's right here, and as one of the people who was part of At Risk and is part of the original paper way back when that kickstarted all of this. And you look at it and there's, I mean, as we've just talked about, there is political will, there's political incentive, there's the corruption, and there's reasons why there would be resistance to doing a lot of these things. And that's not just at the government level. That's, I mean, the UN agencies have their own silos and their own ways of doing. And for a long time, I mean, response, even now, it continues. I mean, some things, I don't know if anybody here is from WFP. I don't want to single out WFP, but like, it's one of the examples I use is if your entire thing, if your entire basis for existence is giving away food, it's not going to be very easy to say, oh, we should stop giving away food. But they have done it. They have shifted to doing it in a more integrated fashion. There are many places where WFP is now working with UNICEF, working with, you know, other countries and trying to figure out, you know, how do we do this? UNICEF itself is, you know, not only looking at children anymore, they're looking at the parents, because how do you care for the children if you can't care for the parents? And so we need to work with the other agencies and figuring out then how do we get the governments to do this as well? It just isn't happening, you know, forever. How many steps forward, we don't know how many steps backwards. And every time something happens that sets it back, it does set it back, and it's different in different contexts. And so I don't like generalizations. I would rather look at each context and say, you know, why specifically on the spectrum of whether it's working more and working less, is that the case? But I agree with you that it's frustrating that it isn't happening more when it seems so clear cut that it should be happening. But we have all of the different political and other reasons why it doesn't.
Can I seize the occasion to let me let you know my take on this in 30, 40 seconds? I think that we need to, do you remember Robert Chambers' 1993, Whose Reality Counts?
Yeah.
Perhaps we failed that kind of philosophy in the sense that look at the SDGs, you know, it's a proliferation of goals, something absolutely unworkable at the local level. So I think that the politics of place, it's, as you probably know, also an approach, no, recently developed in our scientific milieu. And I feel the absence, you know, of the politics of place in the debate on disasters, you know, to engage more, because we've been proliferating in this very complicated multi-level systems, now this multi-level governance, Sendai, you know, all these kind of important, you know, frameworks orientating what people should do at the local level. And, you know, the things that probably you are doing at the moment in Malawi, they are the very important ones, you know, like those that Benz always talks about Tanzania when he was there, you know, and all these really grassroots actions are really very, very important. And somehow they have to be put back, you know, because we've lost sight of the importance of the local in my understanding. There is too much weight on, look at what is happening with the IPCC now, you know, the Group 1 report. It's a massive top-down operation. Of course, we are all concerned, but it's a top-down operation. I mean, there is no space for local perceptions. They are burning the Amazonia. No, you've been saying that. You know, so what's the meaning of talking about, you know, these huge, you know, frameworks without engaging with a more local perspective?
Agreed. It's very difficult. Every time I'm working at the local level, I get so frustrated, I think I need to work at the higher levels again. Every time I'm working at the higher levels, I get so frustrated, I think I need to be working at the local levels again. But the whole thing of trying to make it merge across is frustrating, but I think the only way we can proceed.
Could I say, could I possibly just follow Andreas with just a short advertisement that in fact Victor and two other people and I are currently writing a new book, and which we originally thought might be a third edition of At Risk. But then we realized, for a variety of reasons, that we need to get beyond, precisely, we need to get beyond that pressure and release framework. We need to get beyond the sort of big conceptualization, however many boxes, however many arrows, you know. We need to look at experience, people's experiences, people's perceptions of risk and their behavior. Now, this isn't to throw all of the structuralism away, but what we're attempting to do with the new book is to find a way of integrating the lived experience of resource versus resistance, of hazard and resource in daily life with all these other structural elements. So I agree completely, Andreas, and in fact, this new book amounts to. We haven't written a preface yet, but I imagine when I do, it'll read something like a mea culpa, something like an autocritique that, oops, you know, two editions of a very, pumping out into the world, two editions of a highly structuralist framework that can be misunderstood, can be misused. And that's exactly why some of the terminology has actually been co-opted and internalized within the UN disaster reduction agency and so forth, you know, and it drives me crazy, and I pull my hair, but there it is, you know, and they're talking about root causes and so forth. So you're absolutely right, and thank you for that, Andreas.
Nice. Hard copies.
So yeah, it has been really interesting to hear like everyone's like who has said something, and I believe it's very important to consider, like, for example, what local communities think and how they can expand this knowledge to other levels as well. And I think that's something that Bob is proposing in the chapter, which is really interesting, and probably like try to ensure those like needs that probably we are missing, and we just go to the last events that in some cases are the disasters, but they are not properly like the cause of those disasters. So I think it was like really, I'm really thankful for that, Bob. I think like you explained very clearly what we also have to consider when we want to work with disaster risk reduction, because it's not only about the events itself, but it's also about like the other aspects that we also have to cover. For example, like these livelihoods that we have to provide to those communities, because sometimes like we just go straight forward to the disaster risk reduction and we miss other aspects that local communities are also facing. And probably they are not even interested in what we're kind of like talking to them. And probably that's one of our mistakes as well as researchers, that we just want to go to the point that is interesting for us, but probably we just miss like other aspects that they consider also important. So I think it was really nice picture about like what we also have to consider and how we can actually work in a different approach. So is there any other question? If there are questions from the students in Portuguese, like just let me know and I can translate to English as well. So everything like was so clear and there are no questions. So if
I just have something to show to Bob for next time we meet, Bob.
yeah, sure.
Ah,
Okay.
nice.
Okay.
I'm ready for that. Sounds good.
So if there are no more questions, I think like it would be nice to hear another song, but if you are happy with that.
Sure. Shall I share screen again?
Sure,
If people want to sing along?
sure.
When you mentioned before, Miguel, about the focus, and I remember as a student, and I remember when I first started working on this, that I thought disaster was the entry point, and the whole thing is the focus was on disaster. And that's usually when I start my presentations, is to say access is the entry point. And that's why we're going to start with the song Access, because that has to be the entry point. The disaster comes much later, because that's only the disruption of the access. So as long as we've got that from that song, then we don't need to repeat that song again, because we've got that. Access is the entry point. So where, oh, this one. So let's do short versions of a couple songs. I mentioned before when I was talking about the need to understand what it is, what's causing the disruptions, what's causing the vulnerability, what are, you know, as Ben just said about the root causes, but not to misuse that word or abuse that word, but to really try to understand, not just looking, you know, in the corrective, in the conservative way of, you know, let's just rebuild the assets the way they were, but start looking at what really is driving the risk. And I remember I was giving a talk some years ago for a course I was teaching, some short course, and I read some papers and this line came up, and so I wrote this just to get that point across. And the chorus is the thing in the square. What drives the risk? The thing in the parentheses is the sing-along part behind me. What drives the risk? What drives the risk? What drives the risk? What drives the risk? What's the problematic system parts that we must fix? To adapt, prepare, and mitigate to optimize losses. We learn who gets hurt most and by what? By asking this, what drives the risk? Are your livelihoods diversified with a stable asset base? What drives the risk? Can your basic social service systems handle the extreme case? What drives the risk? Are contingencies and surge built in a plan that has good governance? Have you done PCVAs to rank what the cause of the losses is? You know what I'm asking is, what drives the risk? What drives the risk? What drives the risk? What drives the risk? What's the problematic system parts that we must fix? To adapt, prepare, and mitigate to optimize losses. Learn who gets hurt most and by what? By asking this, what drives the risk? For our mitigation, can you tell me please what drives the risk? For our preparation, can you tell me please what drives the risk? Hopefully you were singing along. You want another short one?
Yeah, we would like to hear another one. Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Let's make this the last one. I'll shift to the one. Let me do a quick tuning change. know, JC Guyard uses this song in some of his classes. There's a video that we made, and the whole idea is to be understanding what's changing. So the whole point of the presentation too wasn't just about access, but it was the perspective part and the local level understanding of how things are changing, because nobody from the outside is going to be able to look and see what's really changing unless local people have the capacity somehow, regardless of who it is, to be able to look and say, hey, that's not right. That's changing in a way that isn't going to lead to us having the longer term outcomes. I've seen the water start to rise. I know that what's been done's not wise. I know that I can't change what others did, so placing blame won't help me find a new way to survive. So we must seek new options. We must treat what's exposed and weak. We must teach each other. Change before the change becomes too deep. Change what causes vulnerability. Change to be sustained. The original word for resilience that I had was sustainability. That's sustainability. So let us hope that we can move forward with the agility to change while we're also sustaining agility. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. It was like really nice to hear how you also combine arts with the research. I think that's a really nice way to communicate with others. And I think we all may learn something from that as well. So thank you very much. So there is a question from Leonardo Feira Diaz. Does PAMOXI social, wait a second. I think you can read it. Yeah. Does PAMOXI social enterprise offer an internship system for students?
Pardon, say that again?
I don't know. What?
PAMOXI Social Enterprise is who I work through in one of the NGOs I work through in Malawi.
Okay.
So what is the question?
If there is like internships for students.
Oh, interesting. You want to come to Malawi? Difficult in these COVID days. There are no internships through PAMOXI just now, but there are other organizations. I'm also working through a couple of other NGOs that are looking, especially if you're interested in sustainable agriculture, permaculture, other techniques like that, and various others. So yeah, I don't know the logistics of that, but if anybody does want to talk to me about internships or anything else, please get in touch with me.
So is it okay if we share your contact with
that'd be great.
Everyone here in the group? Okay,
yeah.
That's perfect. So
my new friends.
Yeah. So I think if we don't have like any other questions, I think we can wrap up the session. And I really want to thank Bob, Ben, Andrea, and all the students for being in this meeting. And I hope like we can meet once again in person soon, hopefully. And
I'm still disappointed you didn't fly me to Brazil, but next time I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, hopefully soon. So if you guys want to open your camera, probably it would be nice. Then like Bob can see your faces, just in case you want.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Miguel, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no
I think
problem.
I have just one more question about if Bob can talk about the social movements related to the access. What's the situation?
Sorry, social movements related to access. Ooh.
Yes.
In a particular place or generally around the world?
Generally in the world, if, for example, if the social movements related to water is more coordinated, or for housing, if these different assets, if there are a social movement wider that connected these different aspects of assets, such as water, land, and food.
Yeah. I think I should start the same way I started the presentation, is that number one thing, if we're disaster risk management people, is to try to break the paradigm in which we see that as a conflict between access disruption and access, chronic disruption, chronic lack of access, because it's all the same thing. And that's the bridge between, the problem, the divide actually between humanitarian and development, that is still, after all of these years, as Andrea mentioned, that like, it's just heartbreaking that it continues. And after all the talk about LRRD and, even resilience was supposed to be the bridge to make it so that we can actually address chronic problems and acute problems together, there are still so many stumbling blocks to that. So social movements aren't going to be as effective if we still see those as two separate things. They have to be linked together, and it has to be a way where we understand as disaster risk people that it has to start with the social movements of getting people access in the first place and working through marginalized people. And I think there's, like we said before about the spectrum, and I think there's progress being made in some places. And I think some of the social movements, are working towards that. I see some people with, integrated paradigms, integrated approaches, even the resilience approaches, for better or worse, some of them are for better and are making it that we're able to address the problems in coherence and start making it so that people have access, and it's looking at ways of making it so it is less disrupted. But guarded optimism, as was said before, because there's still so many problems with that, and so many problems with conceptually, people not, the people who are leading that not necessarily getting the idea of how it needs to be, but also, the political ecology of it and everything else. So there's still a lot of work to be done. We could find examples, and we could, come up with examples and make a list of, the ones that seem to be better or worse. But I think the general answer in terms of globally, it's that some are making progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done to understand what really needs to be done in terms of looking at access that's done in this way, where it's integrated, of looking at both getting it and then keeping it.
Perfect. Thank you very much again. Yeah, we really hope to meet you all soon in person, and if not, like online as well, to have you once again, like in different meetings. So we are going to just like, we're going to continue organizing like these kind of meetings like every like month, or yeah, more or less every month. And then we are going to invite like different guests to talk about disaster risk reduction. But I don't know if you want to say some last words, Victor?
Oh, I think, yeah, just to acknowledge, to thank the excellent talk of Bob, and the dialogue that we have with this new generation of researchers in Brazil. and we are planning next meetings. Ben will talk on, I think in November, we will discuss the chapter of Ben that Bob cited, and also other excellent articles and chapters that they want to share with us. And the idea is also to invite Andrea Lamps, that also have that also has a chapter in the edited book, and other people from Latin America also. So I think it's important for students. I hope next time they will make other questions. Today they are very shy, but and we hope, Bob, to invite you in the future, because we also have Adriano here in the group that play Brazilian songs, but today he's shy. So it's, we hope to do this in the near future. Okay, so thank you.
We need a scholarship, musical scholarship.
Wow, I like it.
Andrea is wearing
Yeah.
a different t-shirt right now. Yeah, the guitar's one. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's all for today. And thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, hope to meet you again once again. Okay, take care and keep safe.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Ben. And everyone else, nice to meet everybody. See those
Nice to meet you.
old friends and new friends.